Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little different. A journey back to Viking Age Scandinavia, where survival wasn't just difficult, it was an art form most of us would fail spectacularly at. We're diving into what life was really like for ordinary people in 9th and 10th century Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Forget the romanticized warriors and epic sagas Hollywood sold you. The truth? You probably wouldn't make it through your first winter, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this: you've just woken up in the year 875 CE, somewhere along the windswept coast of what would one day become Norway. The good news? You're alive. The bad news? Everything else. Your bed isn't a bed at all. It's a pile of straw and animal furs that smell like they've been marinating in fish oil and wood smoke for the better part of a decade. There's no memory foam, no Egyptian cotton sheets, just whatever pelts your family managed to scrape together from last autumn's hunt. And that hunting, it wasn't a weekend hobby. It was life or death. You blink awake as the wind howls through gaps in the wooden walls of your longhouse. It's the Viking equivalent of an alarm clock, only louder and somehow even less merciful. Your home isn't the cozy timber structure you might imagine from museum displays. It's a dimly lit, smoke-filled tunnel of survival, stretching maybe 60 feet long and 20 feet wide, packed with your entire extended family, their livestock, and whatever food stores haven't rotted yet. The smell. Oh, the smell is a symphony of human existence at its most basic. A potent blend of unwashed bodies, animal dung, fermented fish, and smoke that never quite escapes through the hole in the roof. Scented candles haven't been invented. Even if they had, you'd be burning them for light, not ambiance, and luxury like that would be reserved for jarls and kings. You try to stretch, but immediately regret it because the air inside is barely warmer than the howling wind outside. You're maybe 25 years old, which in Viking terms makes you practically middle-aged. Your joints crack like dry timber, and your back aches from sleeping on what amounts to a pile of organic matter that's slowly decomposing beneath you. Getting out of your furs is a gamble. The floor's either wet from last night's condensation dripping through the turf roof, or frozen solid from the relentless Scandinavian cold. And privacy? What's that? Your entire family, maybe 15 to 20 people spanning 3 generations, are all stirring around you in the communal sleeping area. There's no bedroom, no personal space, no me time, just communal everything, including the livestock that share the other end of the longhouse. Welcome to morning in Viking Age Scandinavia, where you're never truly alone because survival demands that everyone stick together, and the alternative is death. But this is just how your day starts. It only gets more challenging from here. So you've managed to crawl out of your pile of furs and straw. Congratulations. Now nature calls, and it's not calling politely. It's demanding immediate attention. Here's the part where you start missing modern plumbing more than you ever thought possible. There's no toilet, no toilet paper, no flush, not even a questionable gas station restroom to complain about. In Viking Age Scandinavia, Relieving yourself is a community affair, and often a dangerous one. Your bathroom is likely a designated area behind the longhouse, marked by a collection of wooden planks over a shallow pit. If you're lucky, there might be some privacy screening made of woven branches. If you're not, well, modesty was a luxury your ancestors couldn't afford. The smell is biblical, and not in a good way. You hold your breath, do your business as quickly as possible, and then comes the fun part. Cleaning up. Toilet paper? Never heard of it. Most people used moss, leaves, strips of wool, or smooth stones, sometimes nothing at all, which might explain why handshakes weren't as popular as you'd think, and why most social interactions happened at arm's length. But here's where it gets really interesting. In winter, that outdoor privy becomes a frozen hellscape. Imagine trying to answer nature's call when the temperature is 20 below zero. The wind is howling like an angry god, and you have to strip off multiple layers of wool and fur just to access the necessary equipment. Many people simply used chamber pots indoors during the worst weather, which meant someone had to empty them later. Guess who got that job? Usually the youngest family members or thralls, the slaves captured during raids. And if you were traveling, forget about it. Viking expeditions, whether for trade or raiding, meant weeks or months without any kind of proper sanitation. Ships had no facilities whatsoever. You hung over the side if you were lucky enough to have calm seas. If not, you just dealt with it and hoped the smell would blow away in the wind. The whole experience was cold, public, unsanitary, and occasionally life-threatening if you slipped on ice or encountered a wild animal during your vulnerable moment. One wrong step in the dark, and you could find yourself face first in a pile of frozen waste, assuming you didn't break your neck first, and you still haven't had breakfast. But we'll get to that nightmare next. You survived the outdoor privy experience. You deserve a reward, right? Maybe a nice hot meal to start your day, something warm, filling, and comforting? Sorry. This is Viking Age Scandinavia. Comfort food is whatever doesn't kill you, and even that's not guaranteed. Breakfast, if you can call it that, is a grim affair. There are no eggs. Benedict, no coffee, no toast with butter and jam. You sit down near the central hearth to a wooden bowl of something that looks like it was scraped off the bottom of a longship. Welcome to your daily ration of porridge. But this isn't the oatmeal you know. Viking porridge is a thick, often lumpy mixture of whatever grains your family managed to grow and harvest before the first frost. Barley, oats, and rye, often mixed with peas or beans if you're fortunate. It's been simmering in an iron cauldron over the fire, and new ingredients are just added to whatever's left from yesterday. It's less of a recipe and more of an ongoing experiment in not starving to death. The porridge might be flavored with wild herbs, fish oil, or fermented dairy if you have it. Sometimes there's dried fish mixed in, or strips of salted meat if the hunting was good, but don't expect variety. You'll be eating some version of the same meal for months at a time, depending on what your family managed to store for winter. On the side, a hunk of bread so dense it could be used as a weapon. It's made from coarse grain flour, often mixed with bark, nuts, or whatever else could be ground up to make it stretch further. This loaf isn't your friend. You don't slice it so much as attack it with a knife, hoping to break off chunks that won't crack your teeth. What about drinks? You're not sipping orange juice or milk. You're drinking ale, and yes, at breakfast time. Water from most sources is questionable at best, teeming with parasites and diseases that could kill you. So everyone, including children, drinks weak beer throughout the day. It's not because Vikings were constantly drunk. It's because fermented beverages were safer than water and provided necessary calories. The ale is flat, room temperature, and has the consistency of thin soup. It's made from malted barley, flavored with bog myrtle or other wild herbs instead of hops. The alcohol content is low, but it's enough to take the edge off the brutal reality of daily survival. Want some meat or cheese? That's a special occasion food. Most families only ate meat regularly during the autumn slaughter, when livestock that couldn't be fed through winter were butchered and preserved. The rest of the year, you got meat when hunting was successful, which wasn't guaranteed. As for fresh fruits and vegetables, only when they're in season, which in Scandinavia isn't very long. Apples might last into early winter if stored properly. Root vegetables like turnips and onions could be kept in underground storage pits, but by late winter and early spring, you were looking at months of monotonous preserved foods and whatever you could forage. Salt was precious, more valuable than silver in some regions. It was essential for preserving meat and fish, so it was used sparingly. Most of your food was bland by modern standards, occasionally punctuated by bitter herbs or the overpowering taste of fermented fish. Breakfast doesn't energize you so much as it prevents you from collapsing. And now that you've choked down your morning gruel, it's time to get dressed for another day of backbreaking labor. Because in Viking Age Scandinavia, everyone works, or everyone dies. So you've eaten your Viking breakfast and somehow kept it down. Now it's time to get dressed. And if you thought the food was challenging, wait until you experience Viking fashion. Your wardrobe consists of exactly what you're wearing, plus maybe one spare outfit if your family is particularly prosperous. There's no such thing as seasonal fashion, no changing clothes daily, no laundry day. There's just wear this until it falls apart, or until you die, whichever comes first. Your basic outfit starts with a linen undertunic, if you're lucky enough to have one. Linen was expensive and mostly imported, so it was a luxury item. More likely, you're wearing wool directly against your skin, which means you're constantly itchy and developing rashes from the coarse fibers. Over that goes your main tunic, a simple pullover garment that reaches somewhere between your hips and knees, depending on your status and the amount of fabric your family could afford. The wool isn't the soft, processed material you know today. It's rough, scratchy, and often still contains bits of plant matter and lanolin. It's also probably dyed with natural materials, bark, berries, or roots, which means the colors are muted and fade quickly. Rich colors like deep red or purple were signs of extreme wealth, requiring expensive imported dyes. Your pants, if you're male, are basically loose wool trousers held up with a belt or cord. If you're female, you're wearing a long dress with an apron-like overdress called a hangarock, held up by metal brooches that also serve as a display of your family's wealth. These brooches weren't just decorative, they were functional fasteners and often the most valuable things you owned. Over everything goes your cloak, assuming you have one. It's made of thick wool, hopefully somewhat water-resistant, and fastened with another brooch or pin. This cloak is your protection against rain, snow, and wind. It's also your blanket, your tent, and occasionally your shroud if things go badly. Footwear is leather shoes or boots, but not the kind you're imagining. These are simple leather pouches wrapped around your feet and tied with leather strips. They're not waterproof, they're not insulated, and they wear out quickly. Many people wrapped their feet in cloth strips before putting on their shoes, creating primitive socks that were more about preventing blisters than comfort. In winter, you might have fur-lined boots if you're wealthy, or you might just wrap your regular shoes in additional cloth and fur. Frostbite was common, and losing toes to cold was just an accepted risk of winter survival. The whole ensemble is held together with belts, brooches, pins, and whatever else you can use to keep the various layers from falling off. And here's the key detail. You don't wash these clothes, ever. Well, maybe once or twice a year if you're particularly fastidious, but washing meant taking everything to a stream, beating it with rocks, and hoping it dried before you froze to death. Instead, you just wore your clothes until they literally disintegrated, and then you made new ones from whatever materials you could scrounge up. The smell was legendary. By spring, everyone reeked of sweat, smoke, food, and general human existence. But since everyone smelled equally terrible, it was just part of life. Your hair was another challenge entirely. Most people had long hair for warmth, but maintaining it without modern tools was nearly impossible. Combs were carved from bone or antler and were precious possessions. Many people simply braided their hair and left it that way for weeks at a time. Lice and other parasites were constant companions, and there wasn't much you could do about them except occasionally pick them out by hand. Now that you're fully dressed in your itchy, smelly, barely adequate clothing, it's time to head outside and start working. Because in Viking Age Scandinavia, your job isn't a career. It's whatever needs doing to prevent your family from dying, and there's always something that needs doing. Now that you're bundled up in your scratchy wool layers and leather foot wrappings, it's time to step outside and face the most brutal job market in human history. There are no career counselors, no LinkedIn profiles, no coffee break discussions about work-life balance. There's just one simple rule: work or watch your family starve. And in Viking Age Scandinavia, the work never stops. If you're a man, your primary job is farming, and by farming, I mean wresting sustenance from soil that seems actively hostile to plant life. The growing season in most of Scandinavia lasts maybe 4 months if you're lucky. The rest of the year, you're either preparing for planting, desperately trying to extend the harvest, or staring at frozen ground and wondering how you're going to survive until spring. Your tools are basic iron implements that your family probably can't afford to replace. A wooden plow, maybe pulled by an ox if you're prosperous, more likely pulled by your own back and shoulders. A scythe for cutting grain, a hand sickle for detail work, and a collection of wooden and iron tools that would look primitive to a Roman farmer from centuries earlier. The fields themselves are small clearings, some hacked out of endless forests. You didn't inherit nice, flat farmland. You inherited trees, rocks, and swampy ground that needed to be cleared by hand, one back-breaking acre at a time. Every spring, you're fighting the forest's attempt to reclaim your hard-won agricultural space. Barley and oats are your main crops because they can handle the short growing season and poor soil. Wheat is a luxury crop that requires better conditions than most Scandinavian farms can provide. You plant in spring, spend the summer fighting weeds, birds, and plant diseases with no chemical assistance whatsoever, and then race to harvest everything before the first killing frost. And here's the terrifying part. One bad harvest means death. Not metaphorical death, not financial hardship, actual starvation. There are no grocery stores, no government assistance, no backup plan. If your crops fail, you eat your seed grain and hope to survive until you can try again next year. Many families don't make it, but farming is just one part of your job description. You're also a carpenter, building and maintaining the longhouse that shelters your extended family. You're a hunter, tracking deer, elk, and wild boar through dense forests with weapons that would embarrass a modern bow hunter. You're a fisherman, hauling nets through icy waters that could kill you if you fall in. If you live near the coast, you might also be a sailor and trader, joining expeditions to distant lands to exchange furs, amber, and iron for grain, silver, and luxury goods your family can't produce. These trading voyages sound romantic until you realize they involve weeks cramped in an open boat, navigating by stars and instinct, with a very real chance of dying from storms, disease, or hostile reception at your destination. And then there's the raiding. Yes, that part of Viking culture was real, but it wasn't the glorious adventure popular culture suggests. Raiding was economic desperation, disguised as warrior culture. When farming, hunting, and trading weren't enough to keep your family alive, you joined a war band and tried to take what you needed from someone else. It was brutal, dangerous work with a high mortality rate and no guarantee of success. For women, the job description was equally demanding but different. You managed the household, which meant being responsible for feeding, clothing, and sheltering everyone who lived in your longhouse. You spun wool into thread, wove thread into cloth, and sewed cloth into garments. You prepared and preserved food, managed the family's resources, and made sure everyone had what they needed to survive. But you weren't just a domestic manager. You also worked in the fields during planting and harvest. You tended livestock, milked cows and goats, collected eggs, and managed the complex process of turning raw materials into everything your family needed. You were a pharmacist, treating illnesses and injuries with herbal remedies and folk wisdom. You were a midwife, helping other women through childbirth in an era when both mother and baby were at serious risk. Women also managed the family's wealth and social connections. You negotiated marriages, maintained relationships with other families, and often made the economic decisions that determined your household's survival. In many ways, women held more real power in Viking society than they would in later medieval Europe. Children started working as soon as they could walk steadily. By age 5, they were helping with simple tasks like collecting eggs, feeding chickens, or carrying water. By 10, they were doing adult work scaled to their size. There was no concept of childhood as a protected time for play and education. Children were small adults who contributed to family survival or became burdens the family couldn't afford. The work was relentless because the environment was unforgiving. Summer meant 18-hour days trying to accomplish everything that needed doing during the brief season when outdoor work was possible. Winter meant huddling in smoky longhouses, maintaining equipment, telling stories, and hoping your food stores would last until spring. There were no weekends, no vacations, no retirement. You worked until you were too old or injured to continue, and then you hoped your family would take care of you. Many people didn't live long enough to become a burden. The average life expectancy was somewhere in the 30s, and that's assuming you survived the dangerous years of infancy and childhood. And here's what made it all more challenging. You were doing this work while dealing with constant hunger, chronic cold, and the ever-present threat of violence. Neighboring families might decide your land or resources looked better than theirs. Competing clans might raid your settlement. Foreign enemies might arrive by ship and burn everything you'd worked to build. Every day was a calculated risk. Work too hard and injure yourself, and you might not be able to work at all. Don't work hard enough, and your family starves. The margin for error was essentially zero, and the consequences of failure were immediate and permanent. So when you hear about Viking warriors and epic adventures, remember that behind every saga was a farmer who spent most of his life bent over in muddy fields, racing against time and weather to grow enough food to survive another year. The raids and battles were just the dramatic punctuation marks in lives defined by agricultural desperation and the constant struggle against a hostile environment. Your job in Viking Age Scandinavia wasn't about personal fulfillment or career advancement. It was about staying alive long enough to help your family stay alive, and hoping that somewhere in that cycle of survival, you might find moments of joy, community, and meaning. But we haven't even talked about the weather yet. And in Scandinavia, the weather isn't just a topic of conversation. It's an active participant in your daily struggle for survival, one that's usually trying to kill you. The climate of Viking Age Scandinavia was actually somewhat warmer than it would become in later centuries, but that's like saying a grizzly bear is friendlier than a polar bear. It was still a landscape designed to test human endurance to its absolute limits. Winter wasn't just cold. It was a months-long siege that started in October and didn't fully lift until April or May. Temperatures regularly dropped well below 0 Fahrenheit, and the combination of wind, snow, and humidity created conditions that could kill you if you made a single mistake. Your longhouse, remember, was heated by a single central fire pit with no chimney. The smoke was supposed to escape through a hole in the roof, but more often, it just filled the interior with a choking haze that burned your eyes and lungs. The fire provided heat for maybe 10 feet in any direction. Beyond that, you were essentially living outdoors. The walls were made of timber, chinked with moss, clay, and whatever else could fill the gaps. They were better than nothing, but they weren't insulated in any meaningful way. Frost regularly formed on the inside walls, and your breath created clouds of vapor, even indoors. Sleeping meant burrowing under every piece of fur and wool your family owned, and hoping you'd wake up with all your extremities still functional. But the cold was just one aspect of winter's assault. The darkness was equally challenging. In northern Scandinavia, the sun might not appear above the horizon for weeks at a time. Even in southern regions, daylight lasted only a few hours, and much of that was filtered through clouds and snow. This wasn't just inconvenient, it was psychologically devastating. Seasonal depression wasn't recognized as a medical condition, but its effects were very real. people became irritable, lethargic, and sometimes violent during the long, dark months. Cabin fever was a literal life or death situation when you were trapped in a smoky longhouse with 15 other people for months at a time. Spring brought its own challenges. The snow melt turned everything into a muddy swamp. Rivers flooded, washing away bridges and making travel dangerous or impossible. The ground was too wet to plant, but your stored food was running dangerously low. This was traditionally the hungriest time of year, when winter stores were exhausted, but new crops weren't ready yet. Summer, when it finally arrived, was a frantic race against time. You had maybe 4 months to grow, harvest, and preserve enough food to last through the next 8 months of winter. Every day of good weather was precious, and a week of rain at the wrong time could doom your family to starvation. The weather also determined whether you lived or died in more immediate ways. Sudden storms could sink ships, killing entire crews of traders or raiders. Unexpected frosts could destroy crops overnight. Drought could dry up water sources and kill livestock. Severe winters could trap families in their longhouses, forcing them to choose between freezing to death or burning their furniture and even structural timbers to stay warm. And unlike modern people, Vikings had no accurate way to predict weather. They relied on folk wisdom, natural signs, and educated guesses. Sometimes they guessed wrong, and people died as a result. Weather also affected your health in ways that compounded over time. Constant exposure to cold and damp led to arthritis, respiratory problems, and other chronic conditions. Frostbite was common, and serious cases led to amputations performed without anesthesia or antiseptics. Many people lived with permanent disabilities caused by weather-related injuries. The psychological impact of living under such conditions can't be overstated. Every season brought its own form of stress and danger. You never got to relax, never got to assume that tomorrow would be better than today. The weather was an unpredictable enemy that could strike without warning and destroy everything you'd worked to build. Modern Scandinavians, with their heated homes, weather forecasts, and emergency services, still struggle with the psychological effects of long, dark winters. Imagine facing those same conditions with none of those advantages, knowing that a single mistake or stroke of bad luck could kill you and everyone you loved. This constant battle against the elements shaped every aspect of Viking culture. It explains their emphasis on fate and fatalism. It explains why they valued courage and endurance above almost all other virtues. It explains why their gods were warriors, locked in an eternal struggle against forces of chaos and destruction. The weather wasn't just background to Viking life. It was the primary antagonist in every story, the enemy that had to be fought and survived every single day. And most of the time, in the long run, the weather won. But surviving the weather was just the beginning of your daily health challenges. In Viking Age Scandinavia, getting sick wasn't just inconvenient. It was often a death sentence wrapped in a very short, very painful story. Let's start with the basics. There were no doctors in the way you'd understand them, no medical schools, no hospitals, no emergency rooms. If you were lucky, your settlement might have a wise woman or man who knew which herbs could help with certain ailments, but their knowledge was based on trial and error, passed down through generations, mixed with equal parts superstition and hope. Most medical treatment was handled by whoever was available when disaster struck. Your mother, your wife, your neighbor, whoever happened to be nearby when you started bleeding or screaming, and their medical kit, some moss for bandages, maybe a few dried plants, a sharp knife that hadn't been cleaned since the last time someone used it to gut a fish, and a strong belief that the gods would either save you or they wouldn't. Broken bones were set by whoever was strongest enough to pull them back into roughly the right position. No anesthesia, no x-rays to check alignment, no physical therapy afterward. You bit down on a piece of leather, tried not to pass out from the pain, and hoped everything healed properly. Many people ended up permanently crippled from poorly set fractures, assuming they survived the initial trauma and subsequent infections. Speaking of infections, they were everywhere and they were deadly. A simple cut from farm work could turn septic and kill you within days. There were no antibiotics, no understanding of germs or sterilization. Wounds were cleaned with whatever was available, usually water that wasn't particularly clean itself, and then covered with whatever fabric could be spared. Childbirth was especially dangerous for women. With no understanding of proper sanitation, no medical instruments, and no way to handle complications, many women died in labor or from infections afterward. Infant mortality was staggering. Families expected to lose several children before they reached adulthood, and those expectations were usually met. But it wasn't just traumatic injuries that killed people. Diseases that we consider minor nuisances today were often fatal. A bad case of what we'd call the flu could kill healthy adults. Pneumonia was a regular killer during the cold months. Dysentery from contaminated food or water could dehydrate and kill you in days. And then there were the epidemic diseases. Smallpox, measles, and other infectious diseases would sweep through communities, killing large percentages of the population. With no understanding of contagion, people had no way to protect themselves except prayer and isolation, which often wasn't practical in communities where everyone lived in close quarters. Dental health was a nightmare unto itself. There were no toothbrushes, no toothpaste, no dentists. People cleaned their teeth with twigs or rough cloth if they bothered at all. By middle age, most people had lost several teeth due to decay or infection. Abscessed teeth could cause infections that spread to the brain and killed you, all from what started as a simple cavity. Mental health problems were understood even less than physical ones. Depression, anxiety, and other psychological conditions were often attributed to curses, evil spirits, or divine punishment. Treatment might involve ritual cleansing, herbal remedies that did nothing, or simply hoping the person would recover on their own. Many people who could have been helped with modern treatment simply disappeared into the wilderness or died by their own hand. The daily diet didn't help with health maintenance. Malnutrition was common, especially during the lean months of late winter and early spring. Scurvy from lack of vitamin C was a problem, particularly for people who spent months at sea. Night blindness from vitamin A deficiency, rickets from lack of vitamin D during the long dark winters, and other nutritional diseases were just accepted as part of life. Parasites were another constant companion. Intestinal worms, lice, fleas, and other creatures made their homes in and on human bodies. There was no effective way to get rid of them, so people just lived with the discomfort and health problems they caused. Some parasites could cause serious anemia or other life-threatening conditions. Work-related injuries were incredibly common and often permanently disabling. Farming accidents with sharp tools, injuries from handling livestock, burns from working around open fires all day, and repetitive stress injuries from the constant physical labor required for survival. A badly injured hand or foot could mean you couldn't work effectively, which meant your family's survival was at risk. The psychological stress of living under these conditions also took its toll. Constant worry about survival, grief from losing family members to disease or violence, and the general harshness of daily life created mental health problems that had no name and no treatment. People dealt with trauma, depression, and anxiety using alcohol, storytelling, and religious rituals that provided some comfort but no real healing. And here's what made all of this worse. Pain was just something you endured. There were no effective painkillers except alcohol, and getting drunk wasn't practical when you needed to work to survive. People lived with chronic pain from old injuries, arthritis from constant exposure to cold and damp, and the general wear and tear of back-breaking physical labor. You worked hurt, you slept hurt, and you hoped you'd die before the pain became unbearable. The average lifespan was short, not just because of dramatic deaths in battle or from disease, but because the accumulated damage from a lifetime of inadequate medical care, poor nutrition, and constant physical stress simply wore people out. By their 30s, most people looked and felt like what we'd consider elderly today. So when you imagine Viking warriors as strong, healthy specimens of humanity, remember that they achieved that status despite having survived childhood diseases, malnutrition, untreated injuries, and constant exposure to conditions that would hospitalize modern people. The ones who lived long enough to become legendary were the genetic and environmental lottery winners, the survivors of a system that killed most people before they had a chance to become heroes. Your health in Viking Age Scandinavia wasn't just about avoiding injury or disease. It was about maintaining enough physical function to keep working despite whatever was wrong with you, because stopping work meant your family died, and dying meant you'd failed in your most basic responsibility as a human being. Now that we've covered the charming realities of Viking healthcare, let's talk about something equally delightful: food safety and the daily gamble of not poisoning yourself with your own dinner. In modern times, we take food safety for granted. Expiration dates, refrigeration, health inspectors, and food safety regulations protect us from most of the things that could kill us at mealtime. Vikings had none of these luxuries. Every meal was a calculated risk, and sometimes the calculation was wrong. Food preservation was a constant battle against time, bacteria, and the elements. Without refrigeration, meat had to be consumed quickly after slaughter or preserved through smoking, salting, or drying. But these preservation methods weren't foolproof, and they certainly weren't standardized. What passed for properly preserved food could vary wildly depending on who was doing the preserving and what materials they had available. Smoking meat and fish was common, but it required maintaining the right temperature and smoke density for days or weeks. Too little smoke, and the food would rot. Too much heat, and you'd cook it instead of preserving it. Get the process wrong, and you'd end up with food that looked preserved, but was actually crawling with bacteria, ready to kill anyone who ate it. Salt was precious and expensive, so it was used sparingly. This meant that salted meat and fish were often underpreserved by modern standards. What Vikings considered adequately salted would make modern food safety inspectors call in hazmat teams. But it was better than nothing, and nothing meant starvation. Dairy products were another minefield. Milk spoiled quickly without refrigeration, so it was usually fermented into various forms of sour milk, cheese, or butter. But the fermentation process was hit or miss. Sometimes you got nutritious, relatively safe fermented dairy. Sometimes you got a bacterial nightmare that could cause severe food poisoning or death. Grain storage was critical for survival, but it was also incredibly difficult to do safely. Grain had to be kept dry to prevent mold and rot, but Viking storage methods were primitive. Underground storage pits, wooden chests, and clay pots did their best, but moisture, rodents, and insects were constant threats. Moldy grain could contain toxins that caused hallucinations, organ failure, or death. The ergot fungus that grew on rye was particularly dangerous. It contained compounds similar to LSD and could cause ergotism, a condition that led to convulsions, gangrene, and death. Entire communities could be affected if they ate contaminated grain, leading to outbreaks of what seemed like mass poisoning or demonic possession. Water safety was another constant concern. Most water sources were contaminated with animal waste, human sewage, or other pollutants. Rivers and streams that looked clean might be teeming with parasites and bacteria. Wells could be contaminated by seepage from nearby waste disposal areas. Even rainwater collected in containers could become unsafe if the containers weren't clean. This is why Vikings drank so much ale and fermented beverages. The fermentation process killed many harmful bacteria, making these drinks safer than water. But brewing required skill and proper ingredients, and a bad batch could be just as dangerous as contaminated water. Foraging for wild plants and mushrooms supplemented the diet, but it was also extremely risky. Many edible plants had poisonous look-alikes, and the knowledge of which was passed down orally through generations. Make a mistake in plant identification, and your family's dinner could become their last meal. Mushroom poisoning was particularly feared because many toxic mushrooms resembled edible varieties. The symptoms of mushroom poisoning could take hours or days to appear, making it difficult to identify the cause. By the time people realized they'd been poisoned, it was often too late to do anything about it. Food contamination from storage and preparation was also common. Cooking and serving utensils were rarely cleaned thoroughly. Food was prepared on surfaces that had been used for everything from butchering animals to treating wounds. Cross-contamination was inevitable when the same knife was used to cut meat, vegetables, and bread without any cleaning in between. Cooking methods themselves could be dangerous. Most food was prepared over open fires, using iron pots and wooden utensils. It was easy to undercook meat, especially larger pieces, leaving dangerous bacteria alive in the center. Overcooking was also a problem, as it destroyed what little nutritional value the food had. Food poisoning symptoms were often mistaken for other illnesses or attributed to supernatural causes. Severe stomach pain, vomiting, and diarrhea could be blamed on curses, evil spirits, or divine punishment, rather than the spoiled fish someone ate for dinner. This meant that people didn't learn from food safety mistakes because they didn't recognize them as food safety mistakes. The cumulative effect of poor food safety was chronic digestive problems for most of the population, intestinal parasites, bacterial infections, and nutritional deficiencies caused by eating contaminated or poorly preserved food were just accepted as normal parts of life. People lived with constant stomach pain, irregular digestion, and the ongoing effects of low-level food poisoning. Seasonal food scarcity made these problems worse. When food was running low, people couldn't afford to be picky about quality. Moldy bread, rancid meat, and questionable dairy products were eaten because the alternative was starvation. The choice wasn't between safe food and unsafe food. It was between possibly contaminated food and certain death from hunger. And here's the truly terrifying part. There was no way to know if food was safe until after you'd eaten it. No thermometers to check cooking temperature, no understanding of bacteria or foodborne illness, no way to test for contamination. Every meal required faith that whoever prepared it had done everything right, and that faith was often misplaced. So when you picture Vikings feasting in great halls, remember that those feasts were also games of Russian roulette, played with bacterial contamination, toxic mold, and spoiled meat. The survivors were the lucky ones, and luck was a finite resource in a world where your next meal might be your last. Winter clothing was your first line of defense against the elements, but it was also a study in compromise, discomfort, and the art of layering whatever you could find. Forget about specialized winter gear or synthetic insulation. Your cold weather wardrobe was whatever animal skins your family had managed to accumulate, sewn together with sinew and hope. The base layer was your regular wool tunic and trousers, which we've already established were scratchy, smelly, and barely adequate for normal conditions. Over that went additional wool garments, each one rougher and more pungent than the last. The goal wasn't comfort, it was survival, and comfort was a luxury that could get you killed. Your outer layer was where things got interesting. Fur cloaks, made from whatever animals your family had hunted or traded for. Bear fur if you were incredibly wealthy or lucky. More likely, you were wearing sheep, goat, or deer hide, with the fur still attached. These weren't the soft, processed furs you might imagine. They were crude, partially tanned animal skins that still smelled like the creatures they came from, mixed with whatever preservation methods had been used to keep them from rotting. Mittens were carved from thick leather or fur, assuming you had them at all. Many people simply wrapped their hands in strips of cloth and hoped for the best. Frostbite was common, and losing fingers to cold was just another occupational hazard of winter survival. Your head covering was crucial because so much body heat escapes through the scalp. Wool caps, fur hats, or simply wrapping your head in whatever fabric could be spared. Many people wore their hoods up constantly during winter, creating a tunnel vision effect that made everyday tasks more dangerous, but was necessary to prevent heat loss. But here's where Viking winter clothing gets really interesting. It wasn't just about staying warm, it was about staying functional. You couldn't bundle up so much that you couldn't work, because work didn't stop just because it was cold. You needed to be able to move, to use your hands, to perform the daily tasks that kept your family alive. This created a constant balancing act. Too little clothing, and you'd freeze to death. Too much, and you'd be unable to work effectively, which could also lead to death through starvation or other survival failures. Most people found a middle ground that left them chronically cold but still capable of functioning. The clothing also had to be durable enough to last through months of hard use in brutal conditions. There were no clothing stores, no easy replacements if something wore out or got damaged. A torn cloak or ruined mittens could be the difference between surviving winter and becoming another casualty of the cold. Keeping these garments dry was nearly impossible and absolutely critical. Wet wool loses most of its insulating properties, and wet fur can actually make you colder than wearing nothing at all. But staying dry in a climate of snow, sleet, and constant moisture was a daily challenge. Many people spent their winters in chronically damp clothing, dealing with the discomfort and health risks because they had no choice. The smell inside a longhouse full of people wearing these winter outfits was legendary. Imagine 15 to 20 people wearing unwashed wool and fur garments that had been soaked and dried multiple times, mixed with wood smoke, cooking odors, and general human funk. Fresh air was a luxury that came at the cost of precious heat, so most families chose warmth over breathability, and at night you slept in your clothes. There was no changing into pajamas or nightgowns. You wore your daily outfit to bed, maybe removing your outer fur layer if you were lucky enough to have adequate bedding. This meant your sleeping furs absorbed months of accumulated body odor, cooking smoke, and general wear. The psychological impact of being constantly bundled up in heavy, restrictive clothing shouldn't be underestimated. You couldn't move freely, couldn't feel things properly through thick mittens, couldn't see clearly with your hood up. It was like being wrapped in a scratchy, smelly cocoon that you couldn't escape from for months at a time. Children faced special challenges with winter clothing. They outgrew garments quickly, but there was no budget for constantly replacing clothes. Most children wore hand-me-downs that were either too big or too small, neither of which provided optimal protection against the cold. Many children simply wore adult clothing that was far too large, creating gaps where cold air could enter and restricting movement in dangerous ways. Women had additional complications with winter clothing. Long dresses and overdresses created challenges for staying warm while still being able to work. The fabric around the ankles would get wet and freeze, creating stiff, icy barriers that made walking difficult. Many women tucked their dresses into their belts or wore them shorter during winter, sacrificing modesty for mobility and warmth. The wealthy could afford better furs, more layers, and higher quality construction, but even they faced the same basic challenges. A rich Viking might have bear fur instead of sheepskin, but they still had to deal with the smell, the weight, and the constant dampness that came with pre-modern winter clothing. And here's what made it all worse. You were wearing these clothes while doing physical labor, chopping wood, hauling water, tending livestock, all while bundled up in multiple layers of heavy, restrictive garments. The physical exertion would make you sweat, which would soak into your clothing layers and then freeze when you stopped moving. This cycle of sweating and freezing was not just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. By spring, when people could finally shed some of their winter layers, the clothing was often literally falling apart. Months of constant wear, moisture, and physical stress would leave garments threadbare, torn, and sometimes completely unusable. This meant that every winter consumed clothing resources that had to be replaced during the brief summer months, adding another urgent task to an already overwhelming seasonal workload. Your winter wardrobe wasn't fashion. It was armor against an environment actively trying to kill you. And like most armor, it was heavy, uncomfortable, and only partially effective. But it was the difference between seeing another spring and becoming a frozen corpse, so you wore it, smelled it, and thanked whatever gods were listening that you had it at all. Now that you're properly bundled up in your medieval hazmat suit of fur and wool, let's talk about the social dynamics of surviving winter in a longhouse with 20 other people who are equally smelly, cranky, and desperate for the season to end. Living in close quarters during the dark months wasn't just physically challenging. It was a psychological pressure cooker that tested every family bond and social relationship. Imagine being trapped in a smoky, dimly lit space, roughly the size of a modern two-car garage, with your parents, grandparents, siblings, their spouses, all the children, and maybe a few thralls or distant relatives who had nowhere else to go. Privacy didn't exist. Every conversation was overheard. Every argument became public. Every personal moment was witnessed by multiple family members. The concept of personal space was meaningless when everyone was huddled around the same fire pit for warmth. You slept pressed against other people, ate with them inches away, and dealt with bodily functions while they watched or pretended not to notice. The hierarchy within the longhouse was strictly maintained, but it was also constantly tested by the stress of confinement. The head of the household, usually the oldest capable male, made decisions about food rationing, fuel consumption, and daily activities. But when resources were running low and tempers were running high, even established authority could be challenged. Women managed the domestic sphere, but they also bore the brunt of maintaining peace within the household. They mediated disputes, distributed food, managed the children, and somehow kept everyone functional despite the mounting tension. The skill required to manage the complex social dynamics of a winter longhouse was extraordinary, and many families survived or perished based on the diplomatic abilities of their women. Children added another layer of complexity. Cooped up kids with no outlets for their energy, no toys beyond simple carved objects, and no escape from adult supervision and stress. They got sick more often in the close quarters, spread diseases quickly through the household, and required constant attention from adults who were already stretched thin. The elderly faced particular challenges. They needed more warmth, more food, and more care, but they also contributed less to the household's survival efforts. The decision of how much resources to devote to keeping aged family members alive was brutal but necessary. Some families were more generous than others, and some winters were harder than others. Thralls, the slaves captured during raids or born into bondage, occupied the lowest position in the household hierarchy. They did the worst jobs, got the smallest food portions, and had no voice in household decisions. But they were still valuable property, so they couldn't be allowed to die from neglect. This created a complex dynamic where they were simultaneously essential and expendable. Mental health problems flourished in these conditions. Seasonal depression affected everyone to some degree, but some people suffered complete psychological breakdowns from the isolation, confinement, and stress. There was no understanding of mental illness as a medical condition, so people experiencing severe depression, anxiety, or other problems were often viewed as cursed, possessed, or simply weak. Violence was a constant threat. Tempers flared over trivial matters when people were hungry, cold, and stressed. Fights over food portions, sleeping arrangements, or perceived slights could escalate quickly in the confined space. Domestic violence was common and largely accepted as normal, especially when directed toward women, children, or thralls. The social rituals that helped maintain order were crucial for survival. Storytelling, games, music, and religious observances provided structured activities that gave people something to do besides brood about their circumstances. Families that maintained these traditions were more likely to survive winter with their relationships intact. Food sharing created its own social dynamics. When resources were scarce, every meal became a potential source of conflict. Who got the largest portion? Were the children being fed enough? Was someone hoarding food? These questions could tear families apart when survival was at stake. The constant presence of death also affected social relationships. People knew that not everyone would survive until spring, and this knowledge colored every interaction. Grudges seemed less important when you might not live to resolve them. Affection became more precious when it might be your last chance to express it. Marriage and romantic relationships faced unique challenges during the winter months. Privacy for intimate moments was nearly impossible, and the stress of survival didn't exactly create romantic moods. Many couples found their relationships severely tested by months of enforced proximity under the worst possible conditions. Leadership within the household required a delicate balance of authority and diplomacy. Leaders who were too harsh risked rebellion or violence. Those who were too lenient risked losing control when difficult decisions needed to be made about resource allocation or survival priorities. The psychological impact of these social conditions extended far beyond winter. Families that survived the dark months together often emerged with either stronger bonds forged by shared hardship or permanently damaged relationships that never fully recovered. The social scars of winter survival could last for generations, and underlying all of these social dynamics was the constant awareness that your survival depended on these same people who were driving you crazy. You couldn't just walk away from family conflicts or personality clashes. You were literally trapped together until spring, and everyone knew it. The successful longhouse households were those that developed effective coping mechanisms, clear hierarchies, and strong leadership. They created routines and traditions that helped manage the stress and maintain social order. But even the best managed households struggled with the psychological pressure of winter confinement. When spring finally arrived and people could spread out again, the relief was enormous. But the social patterns established during those dark months often persisted throughout the year, affecting everything from marriage arrangements to inheritance decisions to the planning of raids and trading expeditions. Your ability to survive Viking Age Scandinavia wasn't just about your individual toughness or skills. It was about your capacity to function as part of a complex social unit under the most stressful conditions imaginable, and that social survival was often harder than the physical challenges of cold, hunger, and disease. Speaking of social challenges, let's examine one of the most misunderstood aspects of Viking society, the role of violence in daily life, and how it shaped every interaction, decision, and relationship in ways that would shock modern sensibilities. Violence in Viking Age. Scandinavia wasn't an aberration or a breakdown of social order. It was woven into the fabric of society as a normal, expected, and often necessary part of life. This wasn't just about the famous raids and battles that captured historical attention. Violence was a tool for resolving disputes, maintaining honor, enforcing hierarchy, and surviving in a world where formal law enforcement barely existed. Personal honor was paramount in Viking society, and it had to be defended through action, often violent action. An insult, a perceived slight, or a challenge to your reputation couldn't be ignored without serious social consequences. If someone questioned your courage, honesty, or competence, you were expected to respond forcefully or risk losing your standing in the community. These weren't just formal duels between warriors. Ordinary farmers, craftsmen, and traders regularly engaged in violence to settle disputes. Property boundaries, trade disagreements, marriage negotiations, and inheritance issues were all potentially violent affairs. The threat of physical confrontation lurked behind every significant social interaction. Feuds between families could last for generations, with each act of violence demanding retaliation. A killing in one generation created obligations for revenge that passed down to children and grandchildren. These blood feuds consumed enormous amounts of social energy and resources, but they were also seen as essential for maintaining family honor and deterring future attacks. The legal system, such as it was, relied heavily on the threat of violence to function. There were no police, no standing armies, no professional enforcers of law. Instead, justice was administered through assemblies called things, where disputes were heard and judgments rendered. But these judgments were only as good as the community's ability and willingness to enforce them through violence. Even within families, violence was a normal part of maintaining discipline and hierarchy. Husbands were expected to physically discipline wives who stepped out of line. Parents beat children as a matter of course. Masters could punish thralls with impunity. This violence wasn't seen as abuse. It was seen as necessary social maintenance. Children were raised in this environment of casual violence and learned early that physical force was a normal way to resolve conflicts. Boys were trained in weapon use from a young age, not just for warfare, but for the daily reality of living in a society where any dispute might turn violent. Girls learned to expect and accept violence as part of their social reality. The famous Viking raids were just an extension of this everyday violence, scaled up and directed outward. The skills, attitudes, and social structures that made raiding possible were developed and maintained through constant low-level violence within Scandinavian communities. You couldn't just decide to become a raider. One summer, you had to live in a society that prepared you for violence from birth. But violence also had rules and boundaries. Even if they seem arbitrary by modern standards, there were proper and improper ways to use force, honorable and dishonorable forms of violence. Killing someone in open combat was praiseworthy. Poisoning them was cowardly. Attacking during daylight was acceptable. Night attacks were seen as shameful. These rules meant that violence was somewhat predictable and manageable, even if it was common. People knew when they were at risk and could take precautions. They understood the social cues that preceded violent confrontations and could sometimes diffuse situations before they escalated. Women, despite being generally excluded from formal combat roles, were not immune to violence or removed from its social dynamics. They could be victims of violence, but they could also instigate it by challenging male honor or demanding that male relatives avenge perceived wrongs. Some women gained reputations for being particularly fierce or vindictive in pursuing family feuds. The economic impact of violence was enormous. Raids and warfare could bring wealth and resources, but they also consumed manpower, destroyed property, and disrupted trade. Communities had to balance the potential benefits of violence against its costs, and this calculation affected everything from agricultural planning to marriage arrangements. Violence also shaped settlement patterns and architecture. Homes were built with defense in mind, communities were located with escape routes, and defensive positions considered. Trade routes were planned to avoid known hostile territories. The entire physical landscape was organized around the assumption that violence was always possible. The psychological impact of living in such a society was profound. Everyone had to maintain a certain level of readiness for violence, which required constant vigilance and stress. People couldn't fully relax or let their guard down because the next dispute or conflict might require immediate physical response. This constant potential for violence also created strong incentives for building alliances and maintaining social networks. Having friends and relatives who would support you in a fight was essential for survival. Social isolation was dangerous because it left you vulnerable to attack without hope of assistance. The seasonal nature of violence added another layer of complexity. Summer was raiding season, when weather permitted long-distance travel and military campaigns. Winter was feud season, when people were trapped together and small disputes could escalate into deadly conflicts. Spring and fall were times for settling scores and preparing for future confrontations. Religious beliefs both justified and constrained violence. The gods were warriors who engaged in cosmic battles, providing divine models for human violence. But there were also religious prohibitions against certain types of violence and requirements for ritual purification after killing. The spiritual dimension of violence was as important as its social and economic aspects. And here's what made it all more complex. This wasn't a society of mindless barbarians reveling in bloodshed. These were intelligent, sophisticated people who had developed elaborate social structures around the reality of violence. They created poetry, art, and literature that celebrated violent heroism while also acknowledging its tragic costs. The legacy of this violent society extended far beyond the Viking Age. The social attitudes, legal traditions, and cultural values developed during this period influenced Scandinavian society for centuries. Some aspects of this violent heritage were gradually civilized and channeled into less destructive forms. Others persisted in modified forms well into the modern era. Your chances of surviving in Viking Age Scandinavia weren't just about avoiding disease, starvation, or freezing to death. They were about navigating a social system where violence was always a possibility and often a necessity. You had to be tough enough to defend yourself and your family, but also smart enough to avoid unnecessary conflicts and build the alliances that would protect you when violence became unavoidable. This was a world where strength mattered, but so did cunning, loyalty, and the ability to judge when to fight and when to retreat. The survivors weren't necessarily the biggest or strongest people. They were the ones who best understood how to function in a society where violence was just another tool for solving problems, as normal and necessary as farming, trading, or raising children. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of surviving Viking Age Scandinavia wasn't the cold, the violence, or even the constant threat of starvation. It was the complete absence of what we'd consider basic human rights or individual autonomy. Your life wasn't your own, your choices weren't your own, your future wasn't your own. You belonged to a complex web of obligations, hierarchies, and social expectations that controlled every aspect of your existence, from birth to death. Let's start with the most fundamental unfreedom. Your social class was determined at birth and was almost impossible to change. If you were born a thrall, a slave, you would likely die a thrall. Your children would be thralls. Your grandchildren would be thralls. There was no social mobility, no American dream of working your way up from poverty to prosperity. You were what you were born, and that was that. Thralls made up a significant portion of the population, perhaps 20 to 30% in some regions. These weren't people who had chosen servitude or fallen into debt. They were captured in raids, born to slave mothers, or sold by their own families during desperate times. They owned nothing, not even their own bodies. They could be bought, sold, traded, beaten, killed, or sexually assaulted at their owner's whim with no legal recourse whatsoever. The work assigned to thralls was the most dangerous, degrading, and backbreaking labor available. They cleared forests, worked in mines, rowed the ships that carried their masters on trading voyages and raids. They were human tools, valued only for their physical capacity to perform tasks that free people didn't want to do. When they became too old, injured, or sick to work effectively, they were often abandoned to die or simply killed outright. But even if you were born free, your autonomy was severely limited by family obligations and social expectations. Marriage wasn't about love or personal choice. It was a business transaction between families designed to consolidate property, create political alliances, or settle debts. Women had almost no say in who they married, when they married, or how many children they would have. Men had more choice, but they were still expected to marry within their social class and according to their family's economic needs. Your career path was determined by birth and circumstance, not by aptitude or interest. If your father was a farmer, you would be a farmer. If he was a craftsman, you might learn his trade. If your family needed warriors, you might be trained to fight. But you couldn't just decide to become something different because it appealed to you. Social roles were rigid, and stepping outside them was not just difficult, it was dangerous. Even your religious beliefs weren't entirely your own choice. Communities practiced religion collectively, and individual dissent wasn't tolerated. You participated in the seasonal festivals, made the required offerings, and honored the gods your community honored. Adopting foreign religious practices or questioning traditional beliefs could mark you as dangerous, untrustworthy, or cursed. Property rights, as we understand them, barely existed for most people. Land belonged to powerful families or chieftains, and you worked it at their sufferance. They could evict you, change the terms of your tenancy, or demand additional labor or payments whenever they chose. You had no legal protection against their decisions and no higher authority to appeal to. Your freedom of movement was also severely restricted. You couldn't just decide to pack up and move to a different region because you didn't like your current situation. Travel was dangerous, expensive, and often illegal without permission from local authorities. Most people lived and died within a few miles of where they were born, not by choice, but because leaving wasn't a practical option. The legal system, such as it was, offered protection mainly to those with social status and wealth. If you were accused of a crime, your fate depended more on your family's political connections than on actual guilt or innocence. Justice was administered by local assemblies, dominated by the most powerful men in the community. Poor people, women, and thralls had little voice in these proceedings and could expect little protection from them. Even your death wasn't entirely your own. Suicide was considered cowardly and shameful, bringing dishonor to your entire family. But more importantly, your death affected everyone who depended on you for survival. You couldn't just opt out of life when things became unbearable because your family needed your labor, your protection, or your social connections to survive. For women, the restrictions were even more severe. They couldn't own property independently, couldn't represent themselves in legal proceedings, couldn't travel alone, and couldn't make major decisions about their own lives without male approval. They were essentially transferred from their father's control to their husband's control, with no period of independent adulthood in between. But women weren't just passive victims of this system. Many found ways to exercise power and influence within the constraints they faced. They managed households, controlled domestic resources, arranged marriages for their children, and sometimes wielded considerable behind-the-scenes political influence. But this power was always unofficial and could be withdrawn at any time. Children had even fewer rights than adults. They were economic assets, future laborers, and potential marriage alliances, not individuals with their own needs and desires. They could be sold into slavery, given away to settle debts, or promised in marriage while still infants. Their education, if any, was determined entirely by their parents' needs and resources. The concept of privacy, which we consider essential to human dignity, simply didn't exist. Your personal business was community business. Your sexual relationships, your family disputes, your financial problems, and your health issues were all subjects of public interest and discussion. You couldn't retreat into a private sphere where you could be yourself without social scrutiny. Even your emotions and personal relationships were subject to social control. You were expected to grieve appropriately after deaths, celebrate enthusiastically during festivals, and show proper respect to your social superiors. Displaying the wrong emotions at the wrong time could have serious social consequences. The psychological impact of living without autonomy was profound. Modern people who experience even temporary losses of freedom often develop depression, anxiety, and other mental health problems. Imagine living your entire life knowing that your choices, your future, and even your basic survival depended entirely on the whims of others. Yet people did survive in this system, and many even found ways to thrive within its constraints. They developed strong family bonds, created meaning through religious and cultural traditions, and found joy in small pleasures and achievements. They weren't constantly miserable because they had no other life to compare theirs to, but they also developed coping mechanisms that might seem disturbing to modern sensibilities. They accepted violence, inequality, and suffering as natural and inevitable parts of life. They found ways to feel superior to those below them in the social hierarchy, even when they themselves had little power or freedom. The wealthy and powerful, while having more choices than common people, were also trapped by the expectations of their social roles. A jarl or chieftain couldn't just decide to live quietly and peacefully. He was expected to lead raids, settle disputes, provide for his followers, and maintain his reputation through displays of strength and generosity. Failure to meet these expectations could result in loss of status, abandonment by followers, or violent overthrow. Religious leaders, craft specialists, and other people with specialized roles had their own constraints and obligations. Their expertise gave them some leverage, but it also made them dependent on the community's continued need for their services. A blacksmith who offended the wrong people might find himself without customers. A priest who lost the community's confidence might be driven out or killed. This system of limited freedom wasn't unique to Viking Age Scandinavia. Most pre-modern societies operated on similar principles, with rigid social hierarchies, limited individual autonomy, and collective decision-making that prioritized group survival over personal choice. But the harsh environment and violent culture of medieval Scandinavia made these restrictions particularly severe, and their consequences particularly deadly. Your survival in this world required not just physical toughness and practical skills, but also the psychological ability to accept your place in the social order and find meaning within severe constraints. You had to learn to want what you could have, rather than hoping for what you couldn't. You had to find identity and purpose in roles that were assigned to you rather than chosen by you. And perhaps most challengingly, you had to do all of this while maintaining enough individual initiative and creativity to adapt to changing circumstances and solve the constant problems that threatened your survival. It was a delicate balance between conformity and independence, between accepting your fate and fighting to improve your situation within the narrow bounds of what was possible. The people who succeeded in Viking Age Scandinavia weren't necessarily those who rebelled against the system or tried to change it. They were those who learned to work within it effectively, building the relationships, skills, and reputation that would give them whatever small measure of security and autonomy was available in their particular circumstances. But even the most successful people in this society lived lives that would seem unbearably constrained to modern individuals accustomed to personal freedom, individual rights, and the assumption that we can shape our own destinies through our choices and efforts. Now that we've explored the social constraints that would crush your modern sense of individual autonomy, let's examine something that might seem more familiar, but was infinitely more perilous in Viking Age Scandinavia. Travel. Every journey, whether for trade, raiding, or simply visiting relatives in the next valley, was a life or death gamble that required careful planning, considerable resources, and a healthy acceptance of the very real possibility that you might never return home. First, let's address the obvious challenge. There were no roads as we understand them, no paved highways, No road signs, no rest stops with clean bathrooms and overpriced snacks. What passed for roads were barely maintained dirt tracks that turned into muddy quagmires in spring, dusty obstacle courses in summer, and frozen death traps in winter. Most of these paths were just wide enough for a single cart, assuming you had a cart, which most people didn't. Navigation was an art form that combined practical knowledge, folklore, and educated guessing. There were no maps available to ordinary travelers, no GPS systems, no friendly locals to ask for directions. You navigated by landmarks, star positions, and the accumulated wisdom of people who had made similar journeys before. Get lost, which happened frequently, and you might wander in circles until you starved, froze, or encountered something that killed you more quickly. The forests that covered most of Scandinavia weren't the pleasant hiking trails you might imagine. They were dense, dark, and filled with hazards both natural and human. Wild animals, including bears, wolves, and lynx, viewed humans as either threats or potential meals. The undergrowth was thick enough to hide ambushes, and the canopy was dense enough to block out most sunlight, even during the day. Bandits and outlaws made these forests their homes, preying on travelers who couldn't defend themselves effectively. These weren't romantic Robin Hood figures redistributing wealth to the poor. They were desperate, violent men who had been cast out of normal society and survived by taking whatever they could from anyone unlucky enough to cross their path. River crossings were particularly dangerous. Most streams and rivers had no bridges, just fording spots where the water was shallow enough to cross if you knew where they were and if the water level was low enough. Spring flooding could make familiar crossings impassable for weeks. Swift currents could sweep away travelers, livestock, and cargo without warning. Weather could turn a routine journey into a survival ordeal. The summer thunderstorms could flood streams, turn paths into muddy swamps, and create conditions where getting lost became deadly. Winter travel was even more hazardous, with blizzards that could disorient travelers within minutes and temperatures that could kill through exposure. Food and water for the journey had to be carried, which limited how far you could travel and how much other cargo you could bring. Most travelers carried dried fish, hard bread, and fermented dairy products that wouldn't spoil quickly. But calculating food needs was tricky. Underestimate, and you'd starve before reaching your destination. Overestimate, and you'd be carrying unnecessary weight that slowed you down and made you more vulnerable to attack. Shelter was whatever you could find or build. There were no inns, no hotels, no friendly bed and breakfasts along the route. You slept under the stars, in crude lean-tos built from branches and leaves, or in caves if you were lucky enough to find them. This meant being exposed to weather, wild animals, and human predators throughout your journey. Traveling alone was essentially suicide, but traveling in groups created its own problems. More people meant more food requirements, more potential for disagreement about routes and timing, and more difficulty in hiding from threats. But it also meant more people to stand watch, share the work of making camp, and fight off attackers if necessary. The timing of travel was critical. Spring meant muddy roads and flooded rivers, but also longer daylight hours and warming weather. Summer offered the best conditions, but was also when most people were busy with agricultural work that couldn't be postponed. Fall was harvest time, when travel was difficult to justify economically. Winter travel was possible, but extremely dangerous. Maritime travel was an alternative for coastal communities, but it came with its own set of lethal challenges. Viking ships, despite their reputation, were open boats with no protection from weather. Storms could sink them, waves could swamp them, and navigation errors could send them far off course into empty ocean where they'd never be found. Coastal navigation required detailed knowledge of currents, tides, weather patterns, and seasonal variations. This knowledge was passed down through generations of sailors, but it was still imperfect and sometimes deadly wrong. Many ships simply disappeared, their crews never seen again. Even successful sea voyages were miserable experiences. Passengers and crew were exposed to constant spray, wind, and sun. There was no shelter, no privacy, no comfort of any kind. Food was cold and often spoiled by salt water. Fresh water was rationed carefully because there was no way to replenish it during the voyage. The social dynamics of travel created additional risks. Travelers were strangers in the communities they passed through, making them objects of suspicion, potential targets for robbery, or convenient scapegoats if something went wrong. Local customs and laws varied from region to region, and violations could result in fines, imprisonment, or death. Language barriers complicated everything. Even within Scandinavia, dialects and regional variations could make communication difficult. Misunderstandings about prices, directions, or local customs could lead to conflicts that turned violent quickly. Trade expeditions, which were the most common reason for long-distance travel, required substantial capital investment with no guarantee of return. The goods you carried could be stolen, spoiled, or prove worthless at your destination. Market conditions could change while you were traveling, leaving you with cargo nobody wanted. Diplomatic and family visits were somewhat safer because you had known destinations and people expecting you, but they still required crossing the same dangerous terrain and dealing with the same hazards. Even short journeys to visit relatives in neighboring settlements could end in disaster if weather, bandits, or simple bad luck intervened. The psychological stress of travel was enormous. Every day brought new dangers, new decisions that could mean life or death, new uncertainty about whether you'd ever see home again. The mental strain of constant vigilance, combined with physical exhaustion and poor nutrition, took a heavy toll on travelers. Many people simply never traveled beyond their immediate area, not from lack of curiosity or ambition, but because the risks were too great and the potential rewards too uncertain. They lived their entire lives within a radius of maybe 10 or 15 miles, knowing the wider world existed, but accepting that exploring it wasn't worth dying for. Those who did travel regularly, traders, raiders, and diplomatic messengers, developed specialized skills and knowledge that made them valuable to their communities, but they also had shorter life expectancies and higher rates of injury, disease, and violent death than people who stayed home. Your ability to survive travel in Viking Age Scandinavia depended on careful planning, substantial resources, extensive local knowledge, good luck, and the acceptance that you might not survive the journey. It wasn't an adventure or a vacation. It was a calculated risk that you took only when the potential benefits outweighed the very real possibility of death. And even if you survived the outbound journey and accomplished your goals, you still had to make it home again, facing all the same dangers and uncertainties a second time. Many travelers who successfully reached their destinations never made it back, leaving families wondering forever what had happened to them somewhere in the vast, dangerous wilderness between settlements. As we reach the end of our journey through Viking Age Scandinavia, the harsh truth becomes undeniable. You wouldn't have lasted a week. Not because you lack courage or intelligence, but because survival in this world required a lifetime of conditioning that modern humans simply don't possess. Every aspect of daily life that we've explored, from the moment you woke up in a pile of straw to the constant threat of violence that colored every social interaction, was designed to test human endurance to its absolute limits. The cold that seeped into your bones, the food that could poison you, the diseases that killed without warning, the social constraints that crushed individual autonomy. These weren't occasional hardships. They were the baseline conditions of existence. The people who thrived in Viking Age Scandinavia weren't superhuman. They were ordinary individuals who had been shaped by extraordinary circumstances. They developed calluses where we have soft skin, strength where we have comfort, and acceptance where we have expectations. They learned to find joy in small victories because small victories were often all that stood between them and death. But perhaps most importantly, they understood something that our modern world has forgotten. Life isn't guaranteed. Comfort isn't a right. Survival requires constant effort, cooperation, and the willingness to endure hardship for the sake of those you love. Every day they woke up was a gift. Every meal was precious. Every spring was a celebration of having made it through another winter. Their world was brutal, unfair, and unforgiving. But it was also filled with moments of genuine human connection, fierce loyalty, and the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you've earned your place in the world through your own efforts and endurance. They created art, told stories, loved their families, and found meaning in lives that would seem impossibly hard to us. So tonight, as you settle into your warm bed with clean sheets, safe water, and the promise of tomorrow's breakfast waiting in your kitchen, take a moment to appreciate just how extraordinary your ordinary life really is. The Vikings who struggled through those dark centuries gave us more than just exciting stories and museum artifacts. They gave us perspective on what it means to be human when everything we take for granted is stripped away. Their legacy isn't just in the sagas and archaeological remains. It's in the reminder that humans are capable of enduring almost anything when they have to, and that the soft comforts of modern life are both precious gifts and potential weaknesses. We've gained so much in safety and comfort, but we've also lost the bone-deep toughness and community bonds that made survival possible in a world that offered no second chances. The next time you complain about a delayed flight, a cold cup of coffee, or a slow internet connection, remember the Viking who considered himself lucky to have moldy bread and unfrozen water. The next time you feel isolated or disconnected, remember the families who survived by depending on each other completely, sharing everything from body heat to their last scraps of food. You wouldn't have lasted in Viking Age Scandinavia. None of us would. But we can still learn from the people who did and carry forward their lessons about resilience, community, and finding meaning in the struggle to survive. They faced the darkness and cold with nothing but each other and their own determination. In their honor, perhaps we can face our own challenges with a fraction of their courage. Sweet dreams, and may your soft pillow remind you of how far we've come from those piles of straw and fur. The Vikings earned their rest through suffering. We've inherited ours through their sacrifice.